Hello. Um, we're here with a video that I think is rather important.
It's some good stuff to know, especially if you are not a super experienced traveler.
Yeah, so we're talking about culture shock today.
Culture shock day,
Both of us have experienced this.
I would say so.
So,
Both personally and
yeah, and
people near us.
exactly. So do you want to just give like a short definition of what culture shock is?
Yeah, so culture shock is an experience a person may have when one moves to a cultural environment which is different from their own.
Or even traveling, like especially for
course.
a longer period of time.
Of course. It is also the personal disorientation a person may feel when experiencing an unfamiliar way of life due to immigration or a visit or to a new country, a move between social environments, or simply a transition into another type of living.
Yep. So this isn't even necessarily just traveling abroad or moving abroad. This
Right.
can happen in many different circumstances.
Absolutely.
And so there are 4 stages of culture shock.
Yeah.
And so we'll make a graph and we'll insert it so that you can see it. But culture shock kind of looks like a W.
Yeah.
So the first one is the honeymoon stage. So you're going to a new place, you get to your new destination, and it's really exciting.
Everything's new and fancy and shiny.
Yeah. So you see things kind of through a romantic light, even
Right.
if there are parts of the culture that you don't necessarily agree with or are familiar with or comfortable with.
Right. Stage 2 is sometimes referred to as the negotiation phase. This is where the differences in your own culture and the culture you're experiencing, the new culture you're experiencing, start to clash. There begins to be an obvious conflict with how you're conducting yourself in a new place. Usually causes obvious negative emotions, frustration, anger, and even sometimes feelings of isolation and loneliness. So you're kind of feeling like you're isolated, like you're on an island, like you're the only one that's kind of experiencing this thing that's happening, and it's a little bit disorienting.
Yeah. So stage 3 is usually the adjustment stage. So eventually, that levels off,
Right.
and you start to begin to adjust to the new culture, the new rhythm in whatever place you're in, and this new culture starts to feel kind of normal.
Right. So it's kind of moving your way back up to where we began, feeling a little bit more comfortable. Having a fuller understanding of why cultural differences are there, or why there's a different way of doing things in a new place, and so it just starts to feel a little bit more manageable, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So then the last one is adaptation, and so you're really starting to fully participate in the new place, fully feeling comfortable in the new place, and it shouldn't be mistaken with total conversion. You aren't like completely 100% of a different cultural background yourself,
Yeah.
but people often obviously maintain things from their root culture or their native culture, as it were, and some of those things are to some degree untouchable. I think I experience those things on the daily here, but there's
It's like a mix.
Absolutely, it's a mix.
You take on new bits of culture and you keep old bits of culture.
Right. I think just personally, things I've brought on, I feel myself a little bit less patient in the street when I'm with people, and there's kind of a first come first serve mentality in Peru to the right of way in any circumstance, and so I think I've kind of adopted that. However, on the other hand, I think there are aspects of like quiet spaces and things like that I maintain from my culture, original culture.
Like queuing.
Right, like standing in line.
Standing in line, yeah.
We'll be happy to stand in line, whereas other folks maybe not so much.
Yeah. So the next part of culture shock is reverse culture shock.
And this is fascinating. This is not something that a lot of people even anticipate.
So reverse culture shock is exactly what it sounds like. It is everything that has to do with culture shock except returning to your home or native culture. And so after growing accustomed to a new culture, transitioning back into your native culture can seem really strange.
Yeah.
And a lot of times this can be more difficult to deal with as well.
Yeah.
You can, all of the negative emotions, frustration, loneliness, depression, anxiety, irritability, all those are present again, and sometimes enhanced.
Yeah, it's a weird and strange thing. It's not something you would intuitively expect. You'd think, going back to your home culture would be like a release of sorts. But it's a strange thing. I don't exactly know the quote. We'll find it and I'll write who said it. But they said that travel is ultimately an isolating experience. It's something that it's a very, very powerful set of experiences and knowledge and impact on your life that you can have. And when you go back to your original culture, a lot of times, it's your friends and family. And it's difficult to see things again the same way. Once you exit your culture and kind of take a look back, it's very difficult to excuse some certain things about your culture that you may now realize are not the best.
Most especially if you have traveled or lived in a place that is developing and where poverty is a part of everyday life that you are able to see
Right.
rather starkly.
Right. And experience firsthand in many cases.
So Clint and I thought we'd take the end of this video to talk about our experiences because both of us have had pretty significant reverse culture shock experiences.
I'd say more than anything else.
I will say that I did have a really good friend who had been traveling for a few months, and there was a group of us, there was 3 of us that were really good friends, and one of them started to become really irritable, and she'd snap at us, and the other friend was wondering, what she'd done, or what was wrong, or what was going on. She didn't understand what was happening, and it was just culture shock. And it leveled off, and it's fine. But I think just to be aware of what can happen, you're not as likely maybe to experience it super strongly.
Right.
But then also if someone around you experiences it, you know what's going on, and it's
Right.
not their fault. So you can understand and kind of sympathize a little bit.
Right. My very first experience out of the United States is like literally a perfect textbook example of what happens with culture shock, in so many ways. And I'll try to keep it brief. I had no idea. I'd always heard that culture shock was a thing, but I never really knew what it was or understood it in a significant way. And my first time out of the United States was a month-long trip to West Africa, Sierra Leone in West Africa. And obviously the cultural differences there are significant. You're going from a very affluent place like the United States to a place that just finished one of the 20th century's most brutal civil wars. I mean, it bled in well into the 21st century. And so there was a lot of aspects of that I was just completely unprepared for. So while I was there, I went through exactly those phases of isolation and feeling just angry about differences that I just couldn't wrap my head around. And I look back at them now and I've been like, it's funny when I read what I wrote at the time. It sounded like I was just on hell on earth.
The world was ending.
Right, but like my memories of it are much more beautiful, much more favoring. I guess it's good memories. I wouldn't take them back for anything, but. Upon returning to the United States, it was extreme. Reverse culture shock was absolutely no joke for me. And there's a lot of other circumstances that didn't help that. But I also didn't know how to prepare myself. So there's a lot of things about that. But when I came back, I mean the 6 months after I had come back from Africa was by far one of the worst periods of my life. Just super depressed, could barely function, didn't understand why. I was super angry at everyone who didn't understand. People who, I had a relative who didn't want to even be exposed to or try to understand the place where I went, and that was like the perfect affront at the time. And it just took a long time to get back around my head in the way things are done in my country versus what I had just experienced. for a long time. It was a very, very difficult time for me.
I can attest to that.
Yeah,
as well.
she was around, of course, and so had I known more about culture shock, I think it would have been better, honestly, because I had no idea what was happening. I just felt just completely helpless and just mad as hell, to be honest, and about things that I couldn't really grasp at the time. And now I look back on it, and it's just an absolute textbook case of culture shock. And I've experienced with other folks as well. Dad, if you're watching, I'm sure that he'll remember when we were in Buenos Aires. We had just been gone a little, for some time, several weeks, and it finally just came to a head. And sometimes it's like these triggering moments of discomfort or lack of being able to have something available.
It's like the straw that broke the camel's back.
Exactly. Sometimes it just all of a sudden comes on. In some cases, so it's definitely something to be aware of and be conscious of in the moment.
Yeah, and I would say, so the first time I left the country, before I left, Clint had kind of told me about culture shock and like shown me the graph, which again we'll display, because that really helped me understand a little bit better. So I have never really had a huge problem like with actual culture shock going into a different place. And I think that's helped. So this is one of the reasons we're making the video, because I feel like that helped me a lot. So hopefully this video can help someone else, because the more you know, the better you understand things.
Totally.
But reverse culture shock, like there's always like weird things like that happen. Like every time I travel somewhere and then I go back to the United States, it's always weird to put my toilet paper in the toilet. Like that's one thing that always gets me. But that's not uncomfortable. It's just like, oh wow, okay, well this is what I do now.
Right.
But the last time I went back to the States, if you watched any of those vlogs, I went back to the States early because my grandma was having a bit of a hard time. And this is another thing, anxiety or anything that is even remotely negative can kind of expound and like create this big thing. So when I went back to the States last time, I flew through Toronto, Canada. I flew from Lima directly to Canada, and I went through security and everything, and then got into the gate area, like where the gates are in the airport, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. I suddenly could understand everything everyone was saying. Like, my brain hasn't had to filter out different noises and distractions that I fully understand in so long, because my Spanish isn't that great. And so
it's not that bad.
It's much easier to block out, though, because I don't understand 100% of what's being said as I do in English. And it was kind of panicking, and I realized what was happening, and I got myself into a quieter area. But then, for probably about half the time, the first half of my trip back to the States, I was just a mess. I don't know if my family particularly knows that, so if you're watching, I was a mess. I don't cry often, but I was probably on the verge of tears almost every single day in that first half of my trip. For no particular reason. I mean, I was in a bit of a stressful situation, but it was not enough to have made me act like that. And so it really just compounded into a bigger thing than I thought would happen. So even knowing this stuff, and I knew exactly why I was acting the way I did, but it's like anxiety. You know that maybe something is irrational and you shouldn't be anxious about something, but you still can't quite stop it. So it's something that most everyone probably will have to deal with if you travel or move to a new place or something like that, and it can be hard. Especially if you don't know what's going on, but knowing is half the battle, right?
Yeah, and I think there are a few things that could amplify culture shock. If you're going to a place where just cultural norms are significantly different, if maybe there's religious practices or ethnic practices that are very different, you're going to experience very likely culture shock more strongly. If you're going to a place where they don't speak the same language as you, or if you don't If it's not your first language, number one, but number two, if you don't understand that new language, that could be more significant. Just frustrations with not being able to communicate even simple things.
Yeah.
And geographically, like going to places that are very, very, very far away.
When there's a huge time difference.
Yep, can be very isolating because then just the internet's a wonderful thing, but not having access to people kind of instantaneously like we're sometimes used to can be frustrating and difficult. So just be mindful of the situation you're going to be putting yourself into before you get there, and I think that'll help a lot.
Yeah, I guess if I had to give any advice, I would say, just be aware. I mean, if you're traveling, even if you're going to a resort in Mexico, which is different, but still fairly padded from the regular hustle and bustle of Mexican life, just be aware that things are going to be different, and, you're visiting a new place, and it is their customs, so just kind of go with the flow, I guess, and just be aware that you don't necessarily have to adopt those customs, but that's the way of life.
Right.
So.
But if you have any experiences of your own and you'd like to share them, comment section below. We'd love to hear.
Any suggestions, too.
Yeah, any suggestions or resources to help would be great.
Yep. So I think we'll finish it, and we'll see you in the next video.